Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Tonight at Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah, we welcome Dr. Glenn Lowry. He visits the Dar for the first time. Dr. Lowry is an art historian, and he is the director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City since 1995. He continues the legacy of enriching public life through exhibitions, educational programs, and publications. He has lectured and written extensively in support of museums in society. Dr. Lowry completed his PhD at Harvard University in 1982. He's a member of the Andrew Mellon Foundation's Board of Trustees, a fellow of the American Academy of Art and Sciences, a member of the steering committee of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, and I could go on all night. But I don't want to bore you, although his career is definitely not boring. Dr. Lowry will discuss in between places, making contemporary art in the Middle East. Dr. Lowry will argue, perhaps, in between places takes place as point of departure, the fact that contemporary art in the Middle East can be seen as either the continuation of a historical tradition of Islamic art or as a radical break with the past. These are their thoughts, and they bring fresh outlook onto our concept of modern art. These new thoughts make us eager to welcome Dr. Lowry and listen to his presentation. Of course, if we are to make maximum gain of what he's going to tell us, we have to turn your mobile phone. So please, turn your mobile phone off and let's welcome Dr. Glenn Lowry.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction and for the challenge of trying to keep you engaged with contemporary art in the Middle East. I'm thrilled to be here because I have long been an admirer of Sheikh Hussa al-Sabah and the work of this great program here at the Dar al-Athar. So it's a double pleasure, an honor really, to try and give you a sense of how to think about contemporary art in the Middle East, perhaps in a different way than all of the extraordinarily beautiful objects that I was privileged to look at in storage a moment ago that resonate with a history. So the Middle East and the larger Islamic world have fascinated me ever since I was an undergraduate. I'd intended actually to become a doctor until I took a course on Islamic art at the end of my freshman year at college. Art history was not a subject I had thought a great deal about until then. But I quickly became fascinated by the tradition of 16th and 17th century miniature painting from Iran and India, used to illustrate manuscripts, epic tales such as the lavish copy, let's see if we can make this work, such as the lavish copy of the Shahnameh of Shah Tahmasp, made in the early 16th century for the Safavid ruler Shah Tahmasp, with its hallucinogenic details, or historical texts such as Rashid ad-Din's 13th century Jami al-Tawariq, an attempt to tell the history of the world as it was then understood, and biographies like the Akbarnama that chronicle the life of the great 16th century Mughal ruler of India, Akbar. Later, as a curator of Islamic art at the Smithsonian Institution, my interest expanded to medieval Syrian metalware and 10th century Egyptian ivories and woodwork, as well as the advent of photography in the Middle East in the 19th century. After I became the director of the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto in 1990, and later the director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, my focus switched to thinking primarily about modern and contemporary art. In between places, endeavors to bring together my earlier interest in the history of Islamic art with my more recent preoccupation by looking at a number of artists like Oraib Tukan, Bushra Khalili, Zineb Sedira, Rania Stefan, Wael Shawki, and Walid Rad, among others, who have emerged over the last 15 to 20 years and whose work explores a range of social, political, and cultural issues involved with the Middle East. Some of these artists may be familiar to you, as they have become increasingly well known in recent years. Others may be less so. But as we look at their work together tonight, I hope 3 points will become clear. The first, that we need to think of the Middle East in an expanded, deterritorialized way, that the idea of in-between or in-betweenness helps us understand these artists' work, and finally, that strategies such as mapping and invented histories provide a conceptual frame that enables many artists from the region to deal with highly charged social and political issues that also places them in dialogue with artists elsewhere in the world. The idea of the Middle East is a problematic construct that hardly needs to be elaborated here, other than to say that it describes a region with such significant social, political, linguistic, and cultural differences that it can only be used with the caveat that the term, rather than define a region, is simply a convenient way of referring to a region. Indeed, however we understand the idea of the Middle East, we need to expand that understanding today to include large parts of Europe now inhabited by sizable populations of first and second generation immigrants from the Middle East, the majority of whom are Muslim. For instance, the Muslim population of Stockholm and Marseille is over 20%, Brussels and Paris over 15%, London and Berlin over 8%, and these numbers do not include the recent wave of legal and illegal immigrants. This rapidly changing demographic is part of a phenomenon that the French historian Olivier Roy describes as deterritorialization, the decoupling of those who believe in Islam from specific regions or civilizational areas. These new Europeans participate in a Muslim community that no longer has anything to do with traditional definitions of territory or space and needs to be considered in an abstract or imaginary way, which complicates the idea of diasporic, as many cultural producers from what we might call the region were either born in Europe or now live there. The Middle East, for this community, becomes an idea as much as a reference to a specific area. It signals a set of associations and practices connected to, but not limited by, the region, and it embraces multiple populations living within and beyond the region. The frontier between Islam and the West, as Roy aptly puts it, is no longer geographical and is less and less civilizational. This also means that traditional notions of displacement associated with diasporic communities need to be reconsidered in terms of how these groups negotiate physical as well as psychic and emotional settlement. This idea of an expanded Middle East is also true for the art world in general. Even the most cursory look makes clear the degree to which the art world has become global in scope and practice. It is no longer possible to talk about a single center or even a primary center of artistic production. Cities as disparate as Beirut, Los Angeles, New York, Sao Paulo, London, Berlin, Tokyo, Shanghai, and Istanbul support thriving communities of artists whose work is available to audiences around the world through biennials, art fairs, the internet, print publications, and of course the art market. All of the artists I'll consider here tonight have found a way to work within this ecosystem. They often have patrons from the Middle East as well as elsewhere in the world, and their work frequently appears at major art fairs and auctions, not to mention in museums and critical publications, connecting them to a stabilizing network of other artists. Many of them share a hesitancy and even an ambivalence at being identified by their country of origin or the region at large, not to mention by their religious or cultural affinity. They see themselves as partaking in a cosmopolitan network in the open and fluid exchange of ideas and images that enables. They may live on occasion, or even for the most part, in a nomadic condition, but their work embraces rather than rejects the possibilities that that condition enables. It may be for this reason that their work often deploys different media, from film and video to photography, performance, print making, and even painting. Just as their intellectual or cultural life is shaped by ideas and influences from many different sources, so too are the ways in which they express themselves. The diversity of media these artists use allow them to find multiple means of expression, and their cosmopolitanism in this context becomes a means of asserting their contemporaneity, an affirmation of their access to and familiarity with the most progressive artistic practices and ideas available anywhere in the world, enabling them to create their own artistic community in an otherwise unsettled world. To participate in a globalized world, as Diana Crane has observed, means to be engaged in a process where cultural influences do not necessarily originate in the same place or flow in the same direction. While most of the artists I want to discuss emerged in the early years of the 21st century, they are by no means the first generation of artists from the Middle East to engage with modern or contemporary art. In the Gulf, the Oman Circle Collective and artists of the Emirates Fine Arts Society, centered around Hassan Sharif, who died in 2016, were active throughout the 1980s and 90s. Before that, of course, artists here in Kuwait were active in an arts community as early as the 1930s that included artists like Mojeb al-Dosari, and continues today with artists like Munira al-Qazi, whose work is actually in the Museum of Modern Art, and Sami Mohammed and Thuria al-Baksami, who I was privileged to meet today and was very excited to see their work. They are just some of the many from here who engage with modern art. In Lebanon, artists like Mustafa Farouk, Paul Guiragossian, Salouat Choucher, among many others, encountered modern art during their studies in Europe in the 1940s and 50s and developed respected careers at home and abroad. In Egypt, Surrealism found a home with artists like Georges Henain, Ramses Yunan, and Kamil al-Timasani. Syria, Turkey, and Iraq also supported vibrant, if little studied, artistic communities throughout the 20th century. Often these artists embrace of modern strategies learned either at art academies or at home, or more frequently even in Europe, was part of a larger national agenda closely tied to decolonization and the assertion of a new post-colonial identity. And artists like the Turkish Farolnisa Zaid and the Syrian Marwan Kassab and the Lebanese Etel Adnan, among others, are now enjoying international and critical attention, reflecting the fact that contemporary practices in the Middle East are not an isolated phenomenon, but follow on decades of history. And here's Etel Adnan. The idea of in-betweenness as a lens through which to think about the work of many of the artists I want to discuss grows out of the way many of these artists see themselves and their practices. Harir Sarkisian, for instance, is a Syrian-born Armenian whose early work focused on places of execution, juxtaposing the brutal murders that took place throughout Syria under the Assad regime with the almost banal nature of the locations in which those events occurred. In 2006, he went to Armenia for the first time, and his series, In Between, developed out of what he called the inconsistency in his own identity, an identity shaped by the idea of a proud and self-assured Armenia, promulgated in the Armenian diaspora, and the reality of a country struggling to overcome the remains of a decrepit post-colonial system. The broken and abandoned buildings of his photographs, as well as the desolate and spoiled landscape that seem always present, speak to a system gone awry and unfulfilled aspirations. It is in this emotionally liminal space between failure and hope, with all of its possibilities and traumas, that Sarkissian's work operates. What Sarkissian encountered in Armenia is what Homi Bhabha, the cultural historian and theoretician, would call the disintegrative moment, that sudden disjunction of the present that makes possible the rendering of culture's reach. It is in this highly charged moment of disjunction, Bhabha argues in The Location of Culture, that we must focus our attention and examine the complex relationships born of post-colonial histories and identities. What we must map, he writes, is a new international space of discontinuous histories and realities. In fact, the problem of signifying the interstitial passages and processes of culture that are inscribed in the in-between. This idea of in-betweenness is not limited to Sarkissian or issues of location and displacement, personal and national, intellectual and emotional, regional or historical. All of these are central to the work. All of these ideas are central to the work of the artists associated with the Middle East that I want to talk about. Take, for instance, Dina Haddad-Adin, the Jordanian artist and architect whose work focuses on sites of transition. She writes of the space she explores in her drawings and installations that it is either, and I'm quoting her, the container or the contained, the inside or the outside, what has been and what will be. But in this single transient fleeting moment, real or figment, it is a place of in-betweenness, a state, an edge, a border, a threshold, an ephemeral space of a moving impetus, a momentum of an entrusted change. Sarkissian and Haddadin's concern for place and identity, as well as their sense of intellectual and aesthetic dislocation, is paradigmatic of a larger set of social and political concerns shared by many artists in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. To this end, I want to argue that the Middle East should be seen not as an isolated or foreign place, but as a kind of case study for how we locate ourselves in time and in space in a rapidly changing world whose social and cultural mores are in flux. So let me turn now to some of the artists I've mentioned at the beginning and look more closely at their work. In 2006, the American-born Jordanian artist Oraib Toukan received an email that piqued her interest. It contained an attachment that outlined then-American Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice's plan for a Middle East and included a map entitled The New Middle East, prepared in 2006 by retired United States Army Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters. The map outlined Peters' proposition for how a better Middle East would look, based on a hypothetical redrawing of boundaries, reflecting ethnic affinities and religious communalism. Toukan has 2 master's degrees, one in information systems and another in environmental geography. So she knows how maps are made and how data is used to configure space. But she's also drawn to the absurd and immediately recognized in Peter's maps its inherent contradictions and failings. The idea of an unsettled Middle East, where it is impossible for any history to be fully conceived or developed, is at the heart of Toucan's The Newer Middle East, the work inspired by Rice's plans for the region and Peter's map. The work is a puzzle in the shape of a territorial map of the Middle East made from suspended foam magnet pieces. The installation invites visitors to assemble and reassemble the map as they wish. Toucan decided to make the map into a puzzle after stumbling upon a scientific definition of memory as the ability of a material to return to its original shape after being subject to deformation. The fragments of the puzzle are created by superimposing Peter's map, proposed map of the Middle East, this map, onto the post-Sykes-Picot one and cutting out the areas this formed. The only fixed part of the Middle East is Palestine, the starting point of the puzzle, around which the other pieces can be assembled. This was in response to the treatment of Israel and the West Bank in Peter's plan as territories whose status is undetermined. By invoking the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret pact between the United Kingdom and France that anticipated the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and divided up the Middle East based on colonial zones of influence, Toucan reminds us of the instability of the region's recent history and the problem with so-called nation building. We can compose and recompose states and nations as if they were part of a large jigsaw puzzle, she suggests, yet every move creates a series of repercussions that alters the configuration of a very real space, underscoring the fact that no map can ever be neutral, and the topography of history is subject to a variety of rational and irrational forces. Zineb Sedira, an artist of Algerian descent, born in France in 1963, and now working in London, where she lives, and also in Algiers, offers a more personal look at territory by examining her family's land in three closely related projects of 2016. A photographic diptych titled Un Rêve de Pierre, and the videos tracing a territory and the land of my father. In all three works, Sedira returns to her family's ancestral holdings between Algiers and Constantinople in a region called Petite or Little Kabylie. The region was renowned for producing revolutionaries during early colonial times and even during the War of Independence. Her father's tribe, the Hashem, were fierce fighters, and they owned large tracts of land expropriated by the French in 1871 after the failed Mokrani uprising against colonial rule. Alone or with her father in the videos, she ruminates on this land and the family's history. As Emmanuel Lecoeur has said, sometimes this territory literally becomes a map on which her silhouette continues to wander. A Rêve de Pierre distills this intense feeling of the videos into a profound meditation on charting the land and the sacredness of space. The left-hand side of the diptych depicts a gently rising slope. In the distance, loom electric towers, contemporary intrusions on this ancestral place. Walking from right to left along a furrow in the land and barely perceptible is her father, who fought against the French in the War of Independence and then lived in France for several decades before returning to Algeria in the 1990s. A red line demarcates his path. Tufts of grass protrude from the reddened earth. We sense the arid coldness of winter. In the right-hand image, the earth rises more dramatically. Her father again walks across the field of vision, his path again marked in red. He is performing a kind of ritual for Sedira, tracing from memory the invisible boundaries of the family's property, marking it out pace by pace, so that she can see and understand what will be hers. A red and white striped jalon, or measuring rod, is integral to the work's installation and leans against the wall next to one of the photographs, a physical reminder of the importance of the knowledge her father is transmitting. It is a knowledge that is as much about muscle memory as it is about the mind, reminding us of the Bosnian critic Alexander Heman's observation that while it may be easy to leave your country of origin, and I quote him, what is difficult is leaving its history as it follows or leads you like a shadow. That kind of history is in your body. The Mapping Journey project of Bushra Khalili, a Moroccan artist who lives and works in Beirut and is one of the most interesting projects I know. Begun in 2008, long before the current refugee crisis, and completed 3 years later, the Mapping Journey project is the result of her interest in how people fleeing from political and economic problems were recharting the region as they moved, often illegally, through countries and across borders. In order to learn more about these journeys, Khalili spent time at several transit points like Rome and Tripoli, meeting travelers and listening to their stories. The project consists of 8 stories, each revealed in a single-channel projection. The stories are told in Arabic, English, and French, often switching from one language to the other. Subtitles in English provide the common linguistic denominator. We never see the person telling the story. Instead, each story begins with a map of the Mediterranean basin in the hand of the storyteller, cropped at the wrist. As a story unfolds, each person uses a thick, permanent marker to trace his or her route on the map. The journeys begin in Morocco, Algeria, Sudan, Somalia, Afghanistan, and even Bangladesh, and each has the goal of reaching Europe. One, however, is centered on Israel and the Palestinian territories, and it describes the difficult, even torturous experience of trying to travel from Ramallah to Jerusalem without having to encounter official checkpoints. It reminds us that even the shortest and simplest of journeys can become complicated as arbitrary borders and the politics of occupation affect how we live. Taken together, these journeys map the invisible routes migrants are compelled to travel as they seek sanctuary. In doing so, they reconfigure the region in terms of where and how borders can be crossed illegally. Each story is harrowing and of itself, and often involves time spent in jail, circuitous routes, perilous sea journeys, and desperate attempts to find work. Khalili succeeds in making these stories intensely personal by allowing us to follow in painstaking detail each person's journey, and simultaneously universal by never permitting us to see the face of the storyteller, which compels us to understand each journey as part of the larger migration of the more than 65 million displaced people living in the world today. Working on clandestine journeys and on the underground existence of these journeys generate, Khalili said in a 2011 interview for the Sharjah Biennial, shows both how geography is generated by the clandestine, drifts, forced detours, an expansion of both space and time, latency and waiting, and is a kind of geography of resistance, since these geographies also require the invention of roads that bypass borders, in turn revealing the ineffectiveness and injustice that these limits can generate. If mapping offers artists one way of exploring the liminal space between the known and the perceived, the real and the imaginary, the political and the emotional, the idea of history offers another. Rania Stefan is a Lebanese filmmaker born in 1960. In The Three Disappearances of Sawad Hosni, Stefan examines the the life of one of Egypt's most glamorous movie stars of the 1960s and 70s. Hosni played almost, as many of you know, Hosni played almost every role imaginable, from ingenue to vixen to revolutionary and more. She led a turbulent life with long periods of depression and mental illness and was married 4 times. She died in London in 2001, where she was found face down on the street below her apartment. The cause of her death remains a mystery. Some believe she committed suicide. Others that she was pushed off the balcony by a former lover. Using vintage VHS clips from Hosni's 82 movies made between 1959, when she was a teenager, and 1991, Stefan reconstructs her life through her acting career while providing a vivid portrait of the social and cultural changes Egypt underwent during this period through a rapid montage of images and sounds from these movies. The grainy images and poor sound create an eerie backdrop to the unfolding drama. Stefan has said of her film, "It is built like a tragedy in 3 acts that ends in death." The film operates like a kind of prevision of the tragic destiny of this actress. Here is a clip from the first part of the film.
قولي لي يا نهد، ايه اللي حصل زمان بين بابا وماما؟
ما اعرفش، اللي زعلانين من بعض.
حصل ايه؟ حاولي تفتكري.
مش فاكرة. دي حاجات بعيد قوي، من زمان، أيام ما كنت صغيرة.
افتكري.
الخيال دايما أجمل من الحقيقة.
The 3 disappearances refer to 3 moments in Egyptian history that coincide with Hosni's career. The first is a period from the late 1950s to the Arab defeat in 1967 in the Arab-Israeli War, the first Arab-Israeli War. The second from 1967 until the war in 1973, and the final period from then until 1991, in the Gulf War that coincided with the end of Hosni's acting career and the demise of Egyptian cinema. As the film unfolds from Hosni's joyous beginning as a starlet.
لازم كنت سهرانة طول الليل بتفكري في رؤوف، مش كده؟
أبدا والله يا ماما. بيحبني ما بيحبنيش، بيحبني ما بيحبنيش.
نور عيني
بيحبني ما بيحبنيش.
روح قلبي حبيبي حياتي.
ما بيحبنيش، بيحبني ما بيحبنيش.
بيحبك يا ستي، بيحبك فلاطينا بيه
والنبي صحيح. بيحبني ما بيحبنيش، بيحبني ما بيحبنيش، بيحبني ما بيحبنيش، بيحبني ما بيحبنيش. هي مش عاوزة منك إلا محاولة صغيرة، تقول لها كلمة واحدة بس: أنا بحبك.
From the demise of it, this sort of movement in her career culminates at the end in a bitter, tormented figure that you see here. And as we follow the film over the course of its hour, we also follow the changes in Egyptian culture from its cosmopolitanism of the 1950s and 60s to the restrictive authoritarianism of the Mubarak era. Hosni's history becomes the country's history, and the space of the film becomes the locus of the ruptures of Egyptian culture itself. Ahmad Mater is a Saudi physician who's also an artist. Since 2008, he has been working on a major photographic project, The Desert of Faran, Unofficial Histories Behind the Mass Expansion of Mecca, that explores the holy city's unfolding history. The Desert of Faran refers, of course, to the wilderness and mountains surrounding the city. Mater writes, and I quote him, that since childhood, I have constructed this city from stories, my own experiences, and the indecipherable, fervent mass of others' evocations. These poignant memories have established firm foundations, suffusing my projected dreams of the place with both adventure and the comfort of family. Yet the real city lives so much and so vividly beyond me. End of the quote. Mater, through his contacts, was able to gain almost unlimited access to Mecca, enabling him to reveal it in a new and unexpected way. It is a city of contradictions, the holiest site of Islam, but a massive and kitschy tourist center, a forbidden place for all but Muslims, yet renowned around the world through a small number of cliched images. A city with an ancient history built around the Kaaba, now being overrun by modern construction and high-rise hotels that look like Big Ben. Removed from a distance, Mater writes in the introduction to the publication of The Desert of Faran, I had read in the media about the changes taking place, but it was not until I witnessed firsthand the transformation of the city, at that time in the throes of deconstruction, that I could conceive of their inevitable impending impact. Mater's photographs take us from the dramatic aerial views of Mecca to desolate, forgotten corners of the city, from the Kaaba and adjacent demolition to the shops and hotels around it, the hotels around it, from its leading citizens to the almost invisible migrant and illegal immigrants, and the people who inhabit the street, people who inhabit its streets, to the construction workers transforming those streets into the new Mecca. Mater's project gives us a kind of unofficial history of a city in transition, exploring the socio-political forces of a globalized world on the sacred spaces of Islam's holiest site. Mater takes us literally and figuratively inside the city, enabling us to see how, in his words, many of the significant buildings and spaces that constitute and structure Mecca's history are elided in a march towards the new conception of the city, and the resting places of collective consciousness are lost. While Shawki, an Egyptian artist born in Alexandria in 1971, uses the retelling of history to re-examine regional conflict. He grew up in part in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, and studied at university in Alexandria before receiving an MFA from the University of Pennsylvania. Shawki's most ambitious work to date is a trilogy, Cabaret Crusades, begun in 2010 and completed 5 years later. The trilogy is comprised of the horror show file, which deals with the First Crusade of 1096, The Path to Cairo, which examines the aftermath of the First and Second Crusades, and The Secrets of Karbala, which looks at the complex and conflicting interactions between Christians and Muslims, Sunnis and Shia, and the shifting alliances amongst them during this period. Loosely based on Amin Malouf's Crusades Through the Arab Eyes of 1983, and using 19th century marionettes made of wood in the first video, ceramics in the second, and glass in the third, the trilogy tells the history of the early Crusades through the perspective of Arab defenders of their land. For Shawki, history is a form of entertainment, hence the notion of cabaret. And the Crusades, a tragic series of events in which all sides are guilty of horrific acts and betrayal. About Malouf's text, he has said, I deal with it as if it were the truth, and I think that my treatment of Malouf's text as fact is itself a criticism of history. It's an analysis of how we write history. Historical analysis gives me space to transform those extremely important historical elements into tools and not final results. Shawki's trilogy works on several levels, often developing contradictory or oppositional conditions. For instance, by using marionettes in elaborate sets, he employs an ancient form of theater, yet it is filmed in the latest technology, creating a stark contrast between the medium and its realization. All at the same time, using marionettes instead of live actors allows Shawki to visualize the strings of causality, to make real the fact that events unfold because of past actions and that none of us are free agents. He has said that he prefers marionettes to actors because they have no acting skills. So there's a kind of erasure of the dramatic aspect, making the story dependent on its topic rather than on the skills of the actor. By showing us the terror and deceit of all of the actors in the drama of the Crusades, the false alliances, the murders, the betrayals, and above all, bloodshed, Shawki makes clear that everyone involved was culpable. Now from the second one.
لقد نجح ابن الخشاب في مهمته، وجاءت جيوش السلطان بقيادة مودود لإنقاذ حلب من طنكري. إنهم على أبواب المدينة.
أغلقوا جميع الأبواب واعتقلوا ابن الخشاب وأنصاره في سجن القلعة.
يجب أن نبحث أمر القدس. لا بد من استردادها. يجب أن نتحد لمواجهة الفرنج. أرى أمتي لا يشرعون إلى العدل.
He made all of these marionettes except the ones that are in wood. And here from the final part of the trilogy.
سوف نهلك جميعا. لقد نفد الماء لدينا ولا بد من قتال المسلمين حتى نصل إلى بحيرة طبرية.
لقد حذرتكم من هذا. أفواجنا تسحق الواحد تلو الآخر ولا يملكون الوصول إلى الماء.
In this project, he provides a parable for today where foreign invasion and occupation have again unleashed a series of tragic events, and I'm thinking particularly now of Syria and even Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East, that have resulted in a remarkably similar set of conditions. Perhaps no artist from the region has been more concerned with the impact of history than Walid Rad. Born in Lebanon and educated at the University of Rochester and Boston University, Rad teaches at Cooper Union and works between Beirut and New York. He's best known for the Atlas Group, a project that he ran from 1989 to 2004. Its goal was to research and document the contemporary history of Lebanon, with particular emphasis on the civil wars of 1975 to 1991. The Atlas Group established a website and produced films and videos, photographs, notebooks, performances, and documentation based in large part on the fictional archives of one Dr. Fakouri. Rad's interest was to show how the impact of personal and collective trauma, the result of the devastating wars in Lebanon, affect memory. By examining the way history is constructed from random events and making evident the way we use information to create narratives, the Atlas Group challenged us to think about the underlying structures of what we know. Rad's most recent project, begun in 2007 and still evolving, is called Scratching on Things I Could Disavow, A History of Art in the Arab World. And it's a kind of manifesto of the current artistic condition in the Middle East. It grows out of Rad's simultaneous fascination and skepticism with the emergence of art festivals, forums and workshops, historical and contemporary art museums, foundations, art catalogs, theoretical and historical texts, art schools, journals, and collections. The project, in his words, aims to engage with the progressive as well as the reactionary, the predictable and unpredictable forms that the new infrastructure will have on the making and experiencing of current, past, and future works of art and other cultural events. In short, Rad is concerned with how the vast wealth of the Gulf and the creation of museums and collections in the region will affect the making and consumption of the visual arts throughout the Arab world. The project consists of a series of chapters that address, among other topics, the relationship to artists like Walid Sadek, another Lebanese artist that he is friendly with, the telepathic reception of the names of late 19th and early 20th century Lebanese modernists that he received one day, installation strategies of different museums, the Artist Pension Trust, which was created by an American and an Israeli to allow artists to create their own pensions, but which may in fact be a giant Ponzi scheme, and even the Atlas Group itself. As the project develops, he adds new sections or chapters, or refines existing ones. And for the last several years, he has included a performance in the form of a guided tour of the project set on a theatrical stage. Like the Atlas Group, Scratching on Things I Could Disavow blurs fact and fiction, and is both a conceptual exercise and a complex series of intersecting stories meant to unfold in real time. The skepticism inherent in the project's title, Scratching on Things I Could Disavow, implies a kind of emotional and even intellectual distance from the material, and it's mirrored in Rad's concern about how new institutions in the region, like Mataf, the Arab Museum of Modern Art in Qatar, or the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, are affecting artistic production and consumption. It is an anxiety that even impacts his own work, as one of the sections of the project examines how, after being asked to show the Atlas Group several times in Lebanon and refusing to do so, he finally agrees, only to discover that when the work arrives in Lebanon, it has shrunk to 1/100th of its original size. If the Atlas Group can be seen as an exploration of the events that shaped Ra'ad's youth, then Scratching on Things I Could Disavow examines what it means for him to be an artist today in the rapidly changing world of the Middle East, and especially Lebanon, where because of the traumatic events of the Civil War, there's been what the Lebanese artist and critic Jalal Tawfiq calls a withdrawal of tradition past a surpassing disaster, by which Tawfiq means that in the wake of cataclysms like the bombing of Hiroshima or the Lebanese Civil War, certain works of art become unavailable, effectively invisible to artists, and withdraw out of circulation, just like the Atlas Group was becoming invisible to Ra'ad. They exist in a kind of liminal space to be resurrected if and when a future generation of artists is able to do so. For Ra'ad, and who often cites Tawfiq, this withdrawal is not symbolic, but real. And Scratching on Things I Could Disavow becomes, in this context, a deeply personal inquiry into what it means to make art in the crucible of the Middle East today, with all its conflicting and contradictory conditions about wealth and money, status and importance, identity and history. So let me conclude by returning to the 3 points I made at the beginning of this talk. The first is that to understand the work of many artists from the region, we need to think of the Middle East in an expanded way. This is because the places where they live, in and outside the region, the questions they ask, and the culture they participate in engages the idea of the Middle East writ large, rather than a narrow definition of a specific geography. They are part of a larger Middle East, whose geography is cultural and emotional, not territorial. The second is that the artists considered here use the strategies of contemporary art that are familiar to European and North American audiences, but deploy them to engage and chart social and political issues. Khalili's commitment and compassion for the refugees whose story she tells, for instance, or Toucan's interrogation of colonial region-making and its consequences, or Sadira's interest in her father's land, use the languages and codes of contemporary art, from conceptual mapping practices to film theory and invented histories, in the case of Shawki and Ra'ad, to help us see how structures of power and control affect daily life, alter our understanding of people, and alter the way history itself is experienced. Finally, the idea of in-betweenness helps us understand the way these artists explore the liminal space between fact and fiction, the observable and the imaginary. This is especially true for artists like Shawki and Ra'ad, but it is also true for the other artists I've discussed here. It is in this in-between space, at times metaphorical, at other times symbolic, emotional, or physical, that they seek to interrogate, develop, and ultimately work through. This is the elision that Mate refers to in his study of Mecca, and it is the imaginary of Stefan's reconfiguration of Hosni's life through excerpts from her own films. For many artists, it comes with a condition of diasporic life. For others, it is a recognition that the past lives proliptically in the present, in complex and unpredictable ways. They are constantly trying to balance the contingency of settlement with the reality of itinerancy, and use the instruments of the art world, the market, collectors, funding agencies, publications, and cultural institutions, as Ra'ad so ably demonstrates, to create a network of stabilizing structures, negotiating and renegotiating their place in a world of intersecting and often conflicting ideas and issues. This is the uncertainty built into Scratching on things I could disavow. A project that looks at the history of art in the Arab world with as much affection as it does skepticism, reflecting Rad's own unease with his past and his culture. Or, as Zineb Sedira says, and I quote her, "This multiple consciousness affords you a particular place and space when you are negotiating yourself in relationship to others. It is a space which is often referred to as in between. I do not like to see it as a negative space. Rather, I see it as an active site of exploration that speaks of the different histories and locates identity to a place which is endlessly remade through our own negotiation of boundaries." Thank you very much.